Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Brennan Center's Jorde Symposium. My name is Tom Miles. I'm the Dean of the University of Chicago Law School. Thank you for joining us for today's program. The Jorde Symposium was created in 1996 to sponsor scholarly discourse and writing from a variety of perspectives on issues that were central to the legacy of William J. Brennan, Jr., Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. The Brennan Center named the symposium in honor of its benefactor, Thomas M. Jorde, former clerk to Justice Brennan, and professor of law at the University of Chicago at Berkeley. A unique feature of the symposium is that each year, the honored lecturer presents the same lecture at two different law schools, one in the fall and the other in the spring, with a different pair of prominent commentators at each site. The fall lecture is typically held at the University of California at Berkeley, where Professor Tom Jorde taught for many years. The spring lecture is at a different law school every year. The lecture and the commentaries are published annually in the California Law Review. On behalf of the University of Chicago Law School, thank you to the Brennan Center. We are thrilled to host this year's event and grateful to your partnership over the years, which has produced many successful Jorde Symposia. We're especially grateful to Professor Tom Jorde for his generous support of the symposium, and to John Cowell, Vice President for Programs at the Brennan Center, for organizing today's event. I'm honored to introduce today's speakers. Our distinguished lecturer, Pamela Karlan, is the Kenneth and Harle Montgomery Professor of Public Interest Law at Stanford Law School. In addition to her scholarship and teaching, she serves as the co-director of the Supreme Court Litigation Clinic at Stanford. She is a leading expert on voting rights and has written prominent casebooks on constitutional law, constitutional litigation, and the law of democracy. To her work at Stanford, Professor Karlan brings a wealth of experience in state and federal government. For example, she has served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice and as a commissioner on the California Fair Political Practices Commission. She's also worked with advocacy organizations, including the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Professor Karlan is joined today by commentators, Professors Guy-Uriel Charles and Professor William Baude. Professor Charles is the Edward and Ellen Schwarzman Professor of Law at Duke Law School, where he co-directs the Center on Law, Race, and Politics. He's a leading expert on race, politics, and election law. His teaching and research interests also include campaign finance and redistricting. In July, he will join the faculty of Harvard Law School as its inaugural Charles J. Ogletree Jr. Professor of Law. Professor Baude is Professor of Law and the Aaron Director of Research Scholar here at the University of Chicago Law School. He serves as the faculty director of our Constitutional Law Institute. Professor Baude teaches federal courts, constitutional law, and conflicts of law. His research interests currently include the incorporation of the Bill of Rights, the zeroth restatement of conflict of laws, the structure of incidental rights and powers, and the doctrine of severability. Professor Karlan's lecture today, entitled The New Countermajoritarian Difficulty, will reflect on the Supreme Court's reluctance to reinforce representation through judicial review. The topic is particularly important to examine at a time when the United States may be heading towards a period of anti-majoritarian control due to a combination of structural factors, including the Electoral College and the guarantee of equal suffrage in the Senate, and sociological factors, including the geographic polarization due to sorting. We will proceed as follows. Professor Karlan will introduce part one of her lecture. Professors Charles and Baude will provide commentary. Professor Karlan will have an opportunity to respond and continue with parts 2 and 3 of her lecture. And then we will open a time for attendees to ask questions through the chat function in Zoom. Thank you to our speakers for what I know will be a fascinating discussion. Thank you again to the Brennan Center for organizing today's events. And thanks to all of you who are joining us. Welcome, Professor Karlan. I now turn the program over to you.
Thanks so much, and thank you all for coming. I want to thank the Jorde apparatus at the Brennan Center, and obviously Tom Jorde as well, all of the folks at Chicago who've done so much to set this up, and especially Will and Guy. One of the real pleasures of being as old as I am, which is really old, is that I've actually known both Will and Guy since they were students, although I never had the pleasure of having them as my student myself. And I'm just a tremendous admirer of their work. So I'm looking forward to their tearing mine apart. I have to say also, it feels a little weird to be talking about this paper, which I began writing and completed most of in October in time for the first Jorde lecture, with so much that's happened with regard to American democracy over the last couple of months. But I think there are some things in the paper that bear on those events as well as on the events I was writing about originally. So the countermajoritarian difficulty was a central preoccupation of American constitutional law during the 20th century. And Alexander Bickel, who coined the term countermajoritarian difficulty, located that countermajoritarian difficulty in the courts. Judicial review, he wrote, involved the reality that when the Supreme Court declares unconstitutional a legislative act or the act of an elected executive, it thwarts the will of the representatives of the actual people of the here and now, and it exercises control not on behalf of the prevailing majority, but against it. And when I was in law school, one of the major preoccupations of scholars was to respond to this question about the countermajoritarian difficulty and the legitimacy of judicial review. John Hart Ely, in one of the most influential responses, argued that representation reinforcing judicial review, that's judicial review that tries to make sure the system is more democratic, does not pose the difficulty that Alexander Bickel talked about because it carries out the Constitution's commitment to democratic self-governance. In his words, a constitutional development that has moved continuously, even relentlessly, away from limits on government by majority. But what if both Ely and Bickel were wrong? Bickel in supposing that the countermajoritarian difficulty is really tied to the Constitution, and Ely in supposing that our constitutional development has moved unidirectionally towards greater majoritarian democracy. Observers as diverse as poet Langston Hughes, Professor Alex Kaczar, and at least apocryphally, President George W. Bush have remarked on the cyclical nature of America's commitment to democratic inclusion. Hughes in his poem Longview Negro, Kaczar in his magisterial history of the right to vote, and Bush in the remark that, in his words, we are now on an irreversible trend toward more freedom and democracy, but that could change. In reality, the way our nation is constituted may be interacting with the way our Constitution was written to produce one of those periods of retrenchment in which we move once again towards government by minority. My lecture today is going to explore that interaction. Part one lays out what I think of as the constitution of the American electorate. That electorate is changing demographically, becoming less white, more geographically concentrated and homogeneous, and more divided, not only in its partisan affiliations, but in its value and in its prospects for the future. After I deliver that part of the lecture and Will and Guy respond, I'll then turn to part two. As part two of my lecture will explain, fundamental, hardwired features of our Constitution, in particular the Senate and the Electoral College, are assisting a shrinking white, conservative, ex-urban numerical minority to exert substantial control over the national government and its policies. And then I want to suggest in the final part that the current Supreme Court enables this entrenchment. Far from engaging in representation reinforcing judicial review, the court's decisions recently contribute to what Ely called the ins choking off the channels of political change to ensure that they will stay in and the outs will stay out. So let me start by talking about the changing constitution of the American electorate. For most of the 20th century, the period in which this idea of the countermajoritarian difficulty played such a role in constitutional law, the American electorate was overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly native-born. Moreover, not only was the electorate more homogeneous, but the two mid-century political parties in the United States were ideologically heterogeneous. They overlapped substantially. The demographic and ideological profiles of Democratic and Republican voters were not strikingly different one from the other. The parties looked reasonably similar in their representation of whites and blacks, of men and women. Even liberals were only slightly more populous in the Democratic Party. And that's in part because this was a Democratic Party that was made up of some really quite different blocs, Southern Democrats being quite different in various ways from Northern Democrats. And this was true even on a geographic level. It may surprise those of you who think of San Francisco, and if you read the New York Times article this past weekend about it, they were making fun of San Francisco this way. But even in San Francisco, for example, 44% of the voters cast their votes for Republican Gerald Ford in the 1976 election. And the overlap between the two parties extended to their attitude about how to deal with what W.E.B. Du Bois had called the problem of the 20th century, namely the color line. The Democratic Party prior to the 1960s consisted both of a Southern wing that was committed to the maintenance of white supremacy and a Northern and Midwestern wing whose electoral success depended on the support of Black voters. And there were large numbers of Black voters in the Republican Party as well. But then things changed. By 2010, 12.9% of the US population was foreign born, a figure that's approaching the historic high water marks of 1890 and 1910. And the foreign born percentage of the United States is likely to exceed those marks by 2030. By then also, the net growth in the US population will be primarily a product of immigration rather than of new births. And even new births reflect demographic change. In 2013, for the first time really since European settlers arrived on the continent, a majority of infants born in the United States were non-white. By 2044, more than half of all Americans are projected to belong to a minority group. The implications for the constitution of the electorate are pretty straightforward. Between 1992 and 2012, the non-white share of voters in presidential elections more than doubled, and that share is going to skyrocket over the next few decades. The electorate has also been changing in other dramatic ways that are captured by the title of two recent books. It's undergone a big sort, and it's undergone a great alignment. The big sort is a description of how Americans are increasingly moving to and living in communities that are homogenous with respect to a number of important characteristics, including their values. The great alignment refers to the way in which a range of different socioeconomic characteristics, from race to religion to the nature of one's work to geographic location to ideology, all align. They fuse together and they stack atop each other to create mega identities that get aligned with partisanship. Today, we no longer have two ideologically overlapping parties. To the contrary, Americans perceive the two parties as ideologically further apart than respondents in any other democracy, and they have reason for that perception. America's party affiliations are distinctive in their powerful alignment of ethnicity, ideology, and religion on each side of the divide, what two scholars call an iron triangle that makes US polarization unusually encompassing and sharp. Perhaps the statistic that captures this best and captures this change best is the following. Comes from a survey in which people were asked whether they would be unhappy if their child married a member of the other political party. In 1960, less than 5% of respondents said they would be unhappy about this. But by 2010, a staggering 49% of Republicans and 33% of Democrats responded that way. So America's change in political parties and change in demography is an important piece of the constitution of the American electorate. And that constitution of the American electorate maps onto the US landmass in a really distinctive way. Just as the racial, cultural, and ideological divides between the parties have widened in recent decades, so too has the geographic divide. The number of landslide counties for different candidates has increased dramatically. Most states are not competitive in national elections. This changes dramatically how Americans think about their politics. So what should we make of this change in American politics? Well, it maps onto differences in economics, in prospects for the future, and the like. And it means that one party, right now, the Republican Party is worried that it will lose its grip on political power as the electorate changes in important ways. That growing disjuncture with a Republican Party that rests on a base that is losing its numerical share of the electorate maps onto American politics in important ways. I'll stop here so we can talk about this change in the composition of the American electorate, and then we'll come back to talk about how this is affected by the Senate, the Electoral College, and by the Supreme Court. So I don't know, am I supposed to cold call on one of you, or did you agree on who's going first?
I think I've drawn the straw, whether that's a long straw or a short straw.
Get my notebook out.
Thank you. So thank you, everybody, and Pam for including me in this. I should say I've known Pam long enough that I feel a little bit like this is a setup. So much of what's in part one of the paper seems obviously correct and interesting and important. And I'm nervous to say too many things in agreement about it, though, lest the trap be sprung on me in part two when I have to abandon the Constitution of the Supreme Court and God knows what else. But that said, I do think there are some sort of important things to flag here and think about before we go on. And one big question is how much to see all these trends as sort of fixed and irreversible and real. As I guess President George W. Bush would wonder, is this an irreversible trend or an irreversible trend that could change? Because certainly the paper is written as if this is the strong path of history, and this is going to be a big structural problem we're going to face for a long time in the future. But we're going to think about it differently if, 5 years from now these things realign or move around a little bit than if they're here for a very long time. And everything about the future is uncertain. But that's one that I'm curious to sort of know how much rests on the kind of the broader sense that this is like the arc of history bending towards strong polarization. I also wonder, how much of this is constructed in various ways. So how much of the sort of the sort and alignment reflects just changing choices of the political parties versus how much does it reflect the underlying views of the people on the ground actually moving away? Do we see people moving in and out of the parties because the parties themselves are just, making decisions about what kind of voters to try to appeal to, but everybody's more or less falls in the same place if they took the weird internet tests about their political preferences? Or are we actually seeing people's underlying values move and the parties following them? Like who's leading and who's following, and how much of those just changes in the R or D label, and how much are they real changes in real politics? I think another trend that may be part of this, which Pam knows more about than I do, that people write about in election law, is just the general demise of local politics in being replaced by national politics. As national news medias grow and as various kinds of local media is destroyed, it's just rarer and rarer for people to have partisan preferences on the local level that don't match their feelings about Donald Trump and Joseph Biden, which seems like also a problem. And I can't tell if it's the same problem as this or not, but that could be part of the sort as well, as if it just used to be people cared more about the elections in Chicago, and now they mostly just care about the elections in Washington, D.C. So I'm wondering about all those things. I guess three more things I'm wondering about. It's great just getting to ask questions so far. I'll save my actual affirmative case until part two. Another is this bad? I remember a political science literature I was forced to read in college, in which political scientists decried the lack of polarization in American parties, because there was a theory that the purpose of a political party is to offer people real choice. So there should be really different parties with really different defined menus on a correlated set of stuff, so you could actually vote for one or the other. And I remember everybody complaining when Bush ran against Gore that there was not a real choice between the two, or the choice was too narrow. So if it's right that we've got now real choices and our elections actually are about something, maybe I should be excited, at least until part two tells me how the elections are rigged. Or is this, maybe it's bad for the Republican Party in an ironic sense, in the way that they're going to get tired of winning? Because if part of the setup is going to be that the electorate is changing in a way that disfavors the Republican Party, but the hardwired features of the Constitution and the maps really favor the Republican Party, you end up with a weird, again, a sort of a weird advantage that may be to their detriment, that the Republican Party can potentially win by relying heavily on the map and on various tactics for trying to fence people out of the electorate, rather than having to try to actually win new hearts and minds. And maybe that's the thing we should be really worried about, which in the short run will disadvantage the Democrats, and in the long run will lead to the collapse of the Republican Party. But I guess most of my questions ultimately boil down to, as always at the intermission of a great play, where is this going and who's going to die?
Wonderful. First, thank you to the organizers of Jorde. Thank you as well to Pam for a great paper. As she said, I've known her since I was a student, when she graciously came, answered a call from an unknown student at the University of Michigan inviting her to a conference, and she was the linchpin to that conference, because everybody else said, if Pam's coming, then I'm coming as well. And when I first started teaching, she gave me all of her notes. And so I've been indebted to Pam all the time, although my only bone with Pam is every time I go to write something, I then discover that she wrote it a long time ago and has thought about it better than I could. So it is both daunting and a pleasure to think about this paper that she has written. So I have maybe three questions for the beginner, or just three things to think about. Pam has identified, in my view, two different types of divisions, or two different types of phenomena that may or may not be as equally problematic. So one, the phenomena of diversity. So increasingly, the United States is a multiracial, multicultural, multi-diverse, all the multi-ways polity. And in some senses, we're in the midst of an identity crisis, right? Who are we? Who is we the people? There was an answer, I think, to that in 1776, in a way that in which we are much less sure, at least some of us perhaps, are much less sure in 2021. This also makes me think of Lyndon B. Johnson's speech when upon signing the Voting Rights Act, in which he basically said, well, finally, Black people are included in we the people. That there was a way in which I was descriptively accurate, descriptively puzzling, and descriptively inaccurate, right? Because the battle of inclusion continued to go on for a very long time. But part of the question I think that Pam is raising is that we seem to be in the midst of an identity crisis and trying to figure out who we are as a people, because the polity is changing in so many different ways. And some part of that is neutral, right? That is, this is simply diversity, right? More people, foreign-born people, geographic diversity, et cetera. And part of the other point that she is raising is less neutral, and that's division. And that's closer to the partisan polarization problem that she has very nicely documented in her paper. So what we have is an American polity in which not only do we have two identifiable distinctive parties, one could say, look, this is the implication that Will is making, that's a good thing. So we can perhaps finally implement the responsible party government. But I think what the political scientists and social scientists are identifying is something that's less benign than that. So recently, some social scientists have called this political sectarianism. And the assumption, what they're arguing is that our partisan division reflects riven religious division. And they've identified three features: that it is othering, that we view the other side as aliens, that there's an aversion, that we have a strong dislike to the other side, and then there's deep moralization, that we think we view the other side as really bad people. Right? So it's not just sort of two identifiable parties, excuse me. It is also a partisan division in which we don't really at all like the other side. And this was Pam talked about the fact that people would rather see their kid marry or align with someone of a different race than someone of a different party. And another social scientist has added one other feature to it, which is dehumanization. So one question, right, so there's diversity, but then there's also division. And part of my question is, what is the relationship between the two, right? To what extent is division a function of diversity? And of course, and this is something that Pam knows a significant great deal about and has written about, so it'd be interesting to get her thoughts here as well, the relationship between race and division. Race seems to be a through line in Pam's paper. And so I want curious to hear your views, Pam, explicitly on the role that race is playing, and not just on the diversity front, but also on the division front. And if that's causing this identity crisis, then where do we go from here, right? Because there seems to be, you can't simply say, okay, we're no longer going to be the multiracial, multicultural polity that we are. Where should we go from here? How should we think about that? All right. There's two more thoughts here. One, Pam has also alluded to, Pam, you alluded to the asymmetry between the two parties. And one question that comes to mind is the extent to which, and this will come, I think, more in the second part of the paper, but there's an assumption, I think, in our field that, look, we have two parties and that law ought to treat them similarly. Right? But if they're not similarly situated, and if they are using different strategies for which we think are more or less moral or more or less legitimate, what role can law play in its mediation between the two parties or between rights of individuals? So, for example, to what extent is enforcing voting rights essentially enforcing rights for Democrats, right? And how should we think about that? And so that will be, I'm sure, something that you've thought. I know that you've thought about this, and that will come in the second half. But right where the two parties are not similarly situated, and when their actions have different valence morally, what should follow for law and what should follow constitutionally? And then one last point that your first part brought to mind, which is when we're thinking about these different types of divisions and we're thinking about the partisan sort, the moral valence of looking at the other side, to what extent should election law in particular put a thumb on the scale on a beyond political participation, right? So one perspective I think that the paper has later on is part of the role of the court ought to be to protect political rights and political participation, but what other types of values are at play here that we think both election law and the court should play a role in enforcing? So beyond the pure political process values, are there other types of values that you think ought to come into play, ought to be on the table, as in light of the types of division and demographic changes that you have identified in the first half of the paper? Thank you.
Let me react a little bit to, you've asked some incredibly important questions that I think, we don't have time to discuss all of them, so I want to discuss a couple of them in a little detail. I'd love for you to just jump in, both of you, Will and Guy, as I do this. So on the first point that Will raises, which is about what's fixed and what's changeable, one of the things is clearly fixed, and that is the demographic change of the United States. That's a train that's left the station. Even if we were to cut off all future immigration, you just look at fertility rates in the United States, and you look at the people who've already arrived and unlike the United States of the second Reconstruction period, say 1965 to 70, overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly native born, that's just not going to be the United States anymore. So that one, I think that demographic change is kind of off the table. It's fixed. The other things obviously are all changeable. I mean, if you look back, say, to 2012, the Republican Party did a post-mortem at that point and said, look, where we need to go for our growth is to recognize, among other things, culturally conservative Latinos as a potential source of growth for the party. And there's no particular reason why they should be voting Democratic rather than Republican. But the Republican Party then has taken on, and this is obviously something that could be changed, that is, it's not fixed. They could take on the old style pro-immigration for business reasons view. They could foreground various social policies that might appeal to culturally conservative groups. African Americans in the United States are culturally conservative in a number of ways that the Republican Party could have chosen to appeal to. And those choices obviously were not fixed choices. But this then takes us to essentially, I think, Will's fifth question, which then is going to tie in my view, to Guy's second point in a way. And that's, is the GOP hurt? Will asks, is the GOP hurt by relying on the map rather than going after voters? Which is another way of asking Guy's second question, which is there are two ways to win an election. One is to get more people to support you than supported you last time around. The other is to make sure that fewer people can support your opponents the last time around. And I think the answer to Will's question in a way is, I think, yes, the GOP has been hurt by deciding on a strategy which in the short term may be a very effective strategy, but in the long term, because of the demographic change, may be more difficult for them. And, and this is a place where, to go to, I guess this is Will's fourth question, which was the question about, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? The United States would clearly be better off with two major political parties that have different policies from each other. To quote Barry, I guess it's quoting, maybe it's not, but the choice, not an echo line. We are better off where people feel they have a choice between the two parties. That being said, if one of the parties has moved so much further from the median voter than the other party, then lots of voters don't have a choice. And that'll take us, I think, into the second part of the paper, which is mostly about structure rather than about demography, which is, does the structure of American elections create two parties that are not competing for the median voter, because most people are running in safe districts that tend to push them towards the edge of their party rather than towards the middle of their party? Is the Republican Party's current strategy one where the current Republican leadership doesn't want to change? So whether Will is right or wrong about could they change, the current leadership doesn't want to change and fears that if it doesn't want to change, its strategy for retaining power has to depend on low turnout. I mean, that was what I think Donald Trump said midway through this election cycle, where he said, if we allow everybody to vote, we'll never win another election. Not a good look in a small d democratic country to make that claim. But I think this all does tie back, and this was Guy's first point in a way, to race being a through line on this, that, the United States is an experiment in multiracial democracy. There has not historically been a multiracial democracy, in part because racial fault lines have made that very difficult. And it's really only been in the short period of the first Reconstruction and then the longer period since the second Reconstruction that America has been, in many ways, a multiracial democracy. So I don't know what you guys think about that.
So I just one thought uniting a couple of those is again the question of what could change. So if I'm hearing, I mean, I think we're on the same page maybe, that some of the demographic changes are probably at this point where we're going to be for a long time.
Yeah.
But political polarization, what that means, could change. That could change fast, right? It could be that, I mean, I think there is an asymmetry here. He's right about. It could be that it's just going to take 4 to 8 years of the Republican Party first winning by tight minorities and then eventually getting clobbered to realize they need a new strategy, unless they think they can hold on to power, like have a whole lot of power now. And then at some point they need a new strategy, and it could be something very different. It could be a switch. And then the other thought is,
yeah,
go ahead.
No, I think that's right, to the extent though that people don't become, and this was Guy's point about the division, I think, that people don't become tribalized in a really important way. And I have one footnote in the paper about some research that suggests that people actually now sometimes change their beliefs to fit the beliefs of the party they view themselves as affiliating with, rather than the parties following the beliefs of the followers. I mean, that is, people become more pro-life once they decide they're Republican. They become more pro-choice once they decide they're a Democrat, because lots of things that shouldn't necessarily all run in the same direction. That is, think about the Catholic Church's official positions. It's anti-death penalty, it's anti-abortion, it's pro-workers' rights, right? So you could hold those 3 beliefs, but very few voters hold those 3 beliefs. That is, voters tend to be pro-choice and then anti-death penalty, or pro-life and therefore pro-death penalty. People's views on foreign trade don't necessarily have to coalesce with their views on criminal justice. There's no necessary connection. But now everything seems to be stacking up so that all of the lines run in the same direction. They don't have to, but the question is, once they do, whether that will solidify.
Right, and whether that, because you could imagine, that maybe it's the reverse. That maybe all they need to do is get a new memo saying, actually, the Republican Party is pro-immigration again. And in 4 years, poof, everybody follows the party line.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, sorry.
Right. I mean, and that's so right. So part of the question, I think, is once we've gone down the line of the type of strong, effective political polarization, actually beyond effective political polarization, where people's identities and they've now demonized the other. Right? Is it possible then to reverse that by now having the polity take their cues from the elites? So we do know that we got this far because the electorate has been taking its cues from the elites. But now that we've gotten the electorate down that route, is this reversible? And I think that's an interesting and tough empirical question, whether it is reversible. And you could say, hey, everybody, this is now how we now, this is what we now believe. And by the way, don't invest all of this energy and emotion into it. And one last point, it was rereading V. O'Keefer something recently, and part of what struck me is the fact that where you have bipartisanship is when you can in fact put race off to the side. And it's really interesting that where it is possible to have the 2 parties working together alongside one another. But once you begin to put in other into it, that you have this fairly strong division. And I also wonder whether that's going to make it, or sort of these demographic changes will make it easier or harder, or really harder, to pull us back from the brink of this type of strong negative polarization in which we find ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many of the folks who are attending today are law students, because of course they won't really remember the 2000 election, but I do. And it was a very close election, but I don't think anybody thought it was an existential election. That is, one of the reasons why, even though it was devilishly close, there was no suggestion that people would march on the Capitol. There was no suggestion there'd be riots in the streets or the like, is because people thought the 2 candidates, while they were obviously different on lots of dimensions, nobody thought this might be the last election ever. And nobody thought if the other candidate wins, he's satanic. And what has changed in American politics, and what we haven't seen since really probably around the time of the Civil War, is this idea that people think an election is an existential event. And that level of polarization and that level of demonization is, I think, something kind of new. And this ties in maybe, Will, also with your point about the media, which is we now have a different media than we had. It's not just that the two parties don't overlap. It's also people don't get their news from the local newspaper, which had a moderating effect. They don't get it from the major three networks. They get it from what Cass Sunstein calls the Daily Me. Even if they go to the same news source like Google or something, I think the algorithms will send them different news. I mean, I dare say that the three of us could all type in the same search function and get totally different answers.
So this is getting a little bit into what I think you're going to talk about next, but I'm curious. I think it's right that this is a change. The sort of like every election is now the Flight 93 election. And I wonder, is that demographics? Is that polarization, or is that something else? Because my initial hypothesis is that it's something else. It's more like a lack of faith. There used to be a faith that there were a bunch of constitutional norms or rules or somebody out there who meant that like we were within normal bounds. And now it's just become clear that the bounds are a lot wider than anybody ever thought. So for other reasons, just the running room that the government has is now existential.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting because, when I wrote the paper, I was thinking about the hardwired structure, and you're raising the norms issue on top of that hardwired structure issue, which is, some things that we thought were hardwired turn out just to be norms, and they're guardrails that people just shoot right past. I mean, I don't even think on like just on December 4th, I don't think people thought that what was going to happen was going to happen. I mean, some people might have, that, they say the FBI was writing about it, but, writing memos about it. But I think most people assumed, okay, that's going to be the end, right? And now nobody thinks that's the end. I mean, there was, there was the Jeffrey Bossert Clark, we'll just have a coup. There's Mr. My Pillow showing up at the White House with the memo about, martial law. And I think none of that would have been stuff people would have thought about before. And the question is, why now, right? Is it something distinctively American? I mean, this isn't part of the paper, but it's not just in the United States that you're seeing the rise of this kind of polarization. It's not even just in two-party systems that you're seeing it. You're seeing it in multi-party systems as well.
It seems like we're now in a cycle of anticipated double tit for tat sort of game theory. Like, it's already one thing, like they do something wrong, you do it back twice as hard. And now there seems to be a version of, we think they would do this if they could, so before they get the chance, we're going to do twice as much. And that seems not exactly symmetrical, but to have a version of the, let's talk about packing the court before the court's even done the things we want to pack it for, the coup, the sort of the far reaches of both sides of politics, right?
And you hinted at this one, but the asymmetry here, I think, is actually really important to think through, right? Because there seems to be a propensity of one side to go a bit farther. And I think that's really tough for law if we're trying to think about how do we treat parties evenly, right? So I think that adds a complication. So yeah, I understand that both sides may be thinking about anticipatory retaliation, but it's not clear to me that it's fully symmetrical, that the propensities are fully symmetrical.
Yeah, and Gerald Rosenberg just sent us a question about, what do we do about economic inequality and the role it plays? And I think, obviously that's a huge part of the story. It's both a huge part of the story in the question of, what it explains a lot of the big sort and explains a lot of the great alignment. In the written version of the paper, I have more of a discussion about the fact that in 2016 and in 2020, The most affluent growing counties in the United States vote Democratic. The places that are being left behind are voting Republican in important ways. But this also ties in with the racial issue, which is work by Jonathan Rodden and a couple of the other people that I talk about in the footnotes have found that racial resentment is a better explanator of people's apocalyptic sense about this last election and the elections before it than actual economic insecurity. That is, it's not just economic insecurity, it's economic insecurity combined with othering of the kind that Guy was talking about, and racial and racial lines in the United States. It's not just about money, it's about more than that. So shall we turn to part 2 of the paper and part 3 of the paper? Okay. So in part 2 of the paper, what I try to do is talk about some of the features of the Constitution itself, about the fixed Constitution. And basically, to summarize here, our election system consists of a mix of mutable and hardwired elements. Some of the elements change from election to election. For example, polling places regularly change from election to election. And we saw with the COVID election that the methods of voting changed. Since the reapportionment revolution of the 1960s, the district boundaries changed, not from election to election, but from decade to decade. And that's true at every level of government. Some of the features of our election system, though, are sticky. Some of those are sticky, even if they're not really in the Constitution. One of the ones that I think of as being, 2 of them that I think of as being most interesting are the number of seats in the House of Representatives, which is not fixed by the Constitution. I mean, it is fixed in the sense we have to have at least 50 seats because every state gets at least 1, and we can't have more than 10,000 something seats because the Constitution says you can't have more than 1 seat for every 30,000 people. But beyond that, it's not fixed. Between 1800 and 1910, the number of members of the House of Representatives changed in every single election. The same is true of the method of electing representatives. Since 1842, federal law has required that they be elected from single-member districts rather than at large or using a proportional representation system. And obviously, these sticky features have some major consequences. In particular, single-member districts with first-past-the-post elections lead to a 2-party system, which of course creates special opportunities for polarization. And the scale of our districts, the fact that they're so large, has major consequences for fundraising and for the kinds of people who get elected. But then there are some electoral features that truly are hardwired, that is, they're written into the Constitution itself. And by that measure, perhaps the most hardwired provision of the entire Constitution involves the Senate. Article 5 of the Constitution provides a mechanism for amending the document, a process that's been used repeatedly to change our election rules. But Election 5 ends with a proviso that no state, without its consent, shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. So, before we could even think about changing the Senate, you'd have to amend the Constitution to permit an amendment, and that's not likely to happen anytime soon. The Senate has always been countermajoritarian in an important sense. That is, most of the senators are not elected by most of the people. For example, in 1790, a majority of the US population lived in the 4 largest states, but those states selected only 8 of the 26 senators. But I think it's important to recognize, and this is a part of the paper that I think of as just one of those interesting, in some ways, historical digressions, but it actually has some bearing on present time as well, is that the current composition of the Senate is not simply a product of a 1789 compromise. Rather, it rests on an interaction between that compromise and a series of highly partisan and often directly race-conscious decisions about admitting or not admitting new states. So the Constitution may have required an equal suffrage Senate, but it doesn't require the Senate we now have. For example, during the Civil War and during Reconstruction, Republicans controlled Congress and they pushed through the admission of new states that would help them shore up their control of the national government, even once the Southern states came back into the Union. So for example, While denying admission to the more populous but then democratic Utah, Congress voted to admit Nevada when its population was only 1/5 the size of the next smallest state and was only 1/7 of the population of Utah. Indeed, if Congress had used the traditional criteria it used for deciding whether to admit a state, Nevada wouldn't have entered the Union until 1970, by which time gambling and air conditioning made it possible to live there. So it's important to recognize that, and then to recognize, for example, that the reason why New Mexico and Arizona didn't become states until well into the 20th century, whereas Washington and North Dakota became states 25 years earlier, was because they were viewed as Latino and Catholic by a nation that was white, Anglo, and Protestant. And the politics of admission are not just a relic of the 19th century. Both Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia have larger populations than Wyoming. Puerto Rico actually has a larger population than 20 states. But despite the fact that 78% of DC voters in a 2016 referendum voted in favor of statehood, and despite the fact that 52% of Puerto Rican voters voted in favor of immediate statehood in this last election, there's no real prospect of either of those places being admitted so long as Republicans either control a House of Congress or Republicans in the Senate control enough seats for a filibuster. Now, why is that? It's because of the political consequence of admitting those states. Now, on top of that, I want to mention that the mismatch between control of the Senate and the overall population is growing. According to the 2010 census, a majority of the United States population lives in only 10 states. So those states, which have a majority of the population, elect only 20 of the 100 senators. By 2040, 70% of Americans will live in the 15 largest states. So 70% of the population will elect only 30 senators, leaving less than a third of the population to control the selection of nearly 3/4 of the Senate. Now, even if political affiliations were randomly distributed among small and large states, there'd be a problem here. But the countermajoritarian nature of the contemporary Senate is heightened by the way it maps onto the actual map. The significant supermajoritarianism that the distribution of the American electorate injects into the federal lawmaking process is an aspect of that great alignment that I talked about before. So let me just give you a couple of examples of this. One way to think about this is by comparing the aggregate vote totals for the two parties' senatorial candidates. In 2018, for example, the Democratic candidates for the US Senate received 58% of the votes cast in senatorial elections nationwide, and the Republican candidates received only 38%. This really is landslide adjacent. For example, in 1984, Ronald Reagan won 58% of the nationwide popular vote, and Walter Mondale won 40.6%, and that was understood to be a landslide. But despite the fact that the Republicans lost the nationwide vote by a wide margin, they actually increased their Senate majority. Now, my point here is not to say that if we had had a nationwide vote for who should control the Senate, Democrats would receive 58.8% of that vote. You know, in part because the current construction of the parties, and this goes back to Will's point earlier, is no doubt inflected by the nature of the Senate. The Republican Party can gain a senatorial majority without having to appeal to the nationwide median voter. But my point here is more basic. It's simply that aggregation rules matter. And that skew really affects governance and policy. The Senate helps to redistribute wealth from large population states to smaller ones. Small state bias gives the Republican Party a built-in advantage in control of this, in seeking control of the Senate, and therefore also in deciding who will sit on courts. And I'll just give again one example here. When Justice Ginsburg died last fall, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell argued that Republicans should be entitled to fill Justice Ginsburg's seat, even though voting in the 2020 presidential election had already begun, because in his words, America reelected our majority in 2016 and expanded it in 2018. America did no such thing. Separate elections in different states produced that. So that uneven partisan geography, I think, is even more so in the Senate than the thing that everybody has been looking at so much, which is the Electoral College. And obviously, in this last election, the Electoral College played a huge role because it was absolutely clear by November 5th that Joe Biden had won the election by several million votes. But because the election totals in some of the states were smaller than that, the margins of victory were smaller than that, it allowed for what happened over the 2 months between the election and the inauguration to occur. And the risk that elections will produce nationwide popular vote winners, but nationwide popular vote losers who nonetheless win the election in the Electoral College is actually a real thing now in a way that it wasn't before. The 2016 election was the second time in the 6 most recent elections that a candidate who lost the popular vote won the presidency. While there are at least some other elections where some scholars have suggested the winning candidate received fewer popular votes than a competitor, none of those is really straightforward. And in the paper, I explain why it's really hard to figure out in the 19th century versions and even in the 1960 election, who actually received more popular votes. So, can we have a legitimate government if the candidate who receives fewer votes nonetheless receives a majority? And that's particularly true if who benefits from these so-called electoral inversions is not randomly distributed across the parties. And that's where, again, the popular vote, that's where, again, the geographic difference between the parties makes a difference. It's far more likely that a Democratic candidate will win the popular vote and lose the electoral vote than that a Republican candidate will suffer that fate. And in the comments, Guy was talking about race being a through line, and I suggest in the paper that race is a through line here too, because a large proportion of African Americans in the United States and a large proportion of Latinos in the United States live in the South and Southwest. And yet, because of the way the Electoral College works, their votes have very seldom played any role in presidential elections. Nearly half of the nation's Black citizens live in the 11 states of the former Confederacy. They vote overwhelmingly for Democratic candidates. But in the 21st century, only Georgia once, North Carolina twice, and Virginia 3 times have ever cast their electoral votes for a Democrat. Texas, a state with 38 electoral votes and a population that's 40% Black or Hispanic, has not cast a single electoral vote for the choice of minority voters since 1980. So the question of whether we have a structural system that creates counter-majoritarian pressures and creates a system in which the declining white plurality nonetheless controls the election is not just a feature of politics, but it's a feature of structure. In the final part of the paper, I talk about the Supreme Court's role in all of this. And I point out that the Supreme Court is doing very little to respond to the political difficulties that we face, and doing a fair amount to make it more difficult for the other political actors to do anything about making the system more democratic. The examples I point to in the paper start with the Supreme Court's decision in the Shelby County case, which overrode Congress's attempt to use the Voting Rights Act to ensure full enfranchisement. But it's also the Supreme Court's discussion of partisan gerrymandering. And finally, and this is something that I've been working on since the 2020 election a bit, is the suggestion, I think, by a number of justices on the Supreme Court now that they will not allow any of the other political actors, whether it be the people at large through initiatives, or it be Congress through using its enforcement power, or it be state courts using state constitutional law to ensure full enfranchisement because of a robust protection of the prerogatives of state legislatures, legislatures which are already subject to a certain level of entrenchment and minority control. So I'll stop there so that we can have a discussion of these parts of the paper as well.
Okay, terrific. So once again, I find myself—
I didn't sucker punch you, Will.
I find myself agreeing with a disturbing amount of this paper, but I'm going to wriggle out at the end. So as I see it, there's sort of, one question is, or a big part of the burden of the second part is to show that the Constitution and the sub-constitutional structures, the electoral structure is suboptimal, or worse than suboptimal, is deeply problematic. But the harder question is, who's to blame and what's to be done about it? So I think it's right that the Constitution is not great from a democratic point of view, and that it contains plenty of features like the Electoral College and the malapportionment of the Senate that are hard to defend on first-order normative grounds, and that few people in the system behind the veil of ignorance would pick, so that they're mainly defended by people who, benefit enough from them that they're willing to fight for them. They're not totally lacking in reason. There were reasons to incorporate states into the electoral structure, especially given that we've kind of been constructing the country on the fly as we go at different stages. But I think it's right that those are suboptimal, and that part of the suboptimality is the Constitution's making it hard to amend. So if the question is the Constitution too hard to amend, and should we amend some of these things, I'm inclined to agree. You might not totally agree on what the new amendments would look like, but I'm inclined to agree. And I am, just as an aside, very curious about whether Pam has a view about how hardwired the Senate is. So as she mentioned, you can't take away a state's suffrage in the Senate or equal suffrage in the Senate without its consent. One possible workaround is to do this through two amendments, one to amend Article 5 and then another one to amend the Senate. I'm curious whether she thinks that works. Another possibility, a sort of temporary fix, would be to take away some of the powers of the Senate, leave the Senate as it is, but give confirmations to the House. Maybe everything else the Senate has uniquely to the House. So there could be a Senate, but do they have to do what they do now? Maybe that's another way around it. But that's just a point of curiosity. So I think I agree with a lot of that, and I agree that we might want to change the Constitution. I think some of the burden is also to suggest that some amount of what we sometimes call hardball, constitutional hardball, might be more okay and more part of the American tradition than it currently seems. So DC statehood and Puerto Rico statehood currently seen as a sort of partisan hardball move if the Democrats can get the votes, and one of the reasons that Republicans fear abandonment of the filibuster. And I think part of the point is to show both that in terms of responding to the structure of the Constitution and the history of lots of political state admissions, that's more like just one more normal move in the arsenal and maybe okay. And I'm not sure I disagree with that either, although I don't have a strong view about it either way. And I'd love to see the House expanded. If anybody wants to talk about that, I'm sort of curious why more people don't. Maybe it's just the benefits are a little shorter. It does take me a little back, though, to the question of how much we should see the current alignment, the current as fixed. If this is going to be over in 10 years and some change in the political party's lineup will change, just like Democrats used to have the Senate, back when I was in law school, it seems hastier to do some of these things. Whereas there's reason to think this is a entrenched problem going to be with us for 50 years, I might feel differently about it. And I do also wonder whether, what about the easier strategy of just trying to change your coalition a little bit? So we talked in the first part about the Republican Party changing who it appeals to. If the map's that bad, the Democratic Party could change who they try to keep bringing their coalition and who they don't. Maybe that's just the compromises they have to make politically to get, people in unpopulated red states are not worth it. But it's worth thinking of what they are and how they compare to some of the other tactics. All right, the third thing, the thing on which I think we might actually disagree, is what the Supreme Court should do about it. Because I'm inclined to see all of this as helping to show why Ely and representation reinforcing review is just not a good idea and not the Supreme Court's job. it seems like looking at this whole situation, it seems like the Supreme Court could well say, wow, yeah, the Constitution does make a lot of compromises that aren't the ones we would make if we were in charge of amending it, and we don't support. But boy, whatever our job is not to fix the Constitution. We all agree on that. Our job is to work with what we've got. And so we ought to be really wary, actually, of people telling us we should perfect and improve democracy, because it seems like that's not what the Constitution created. It didn't create a perfect democracy. It created a very intentionally flawed democracy. And we start really getting sort of ahead of our skis if we start trying to do that. And instead, and maybe the Supreme Court should adopt a kind of hyper-formalist attitude, where they take the compromises made in the Constitution, even when they're anti-democratic, and they just live with them. Even if that means they lack power over partisan gerrymandering, and even if that means they assign power over federal elections to state legislatures who aren't who I would assign them to if I was given the choice, but they may be approaching this more from a hyper-formalist point of view. And then I guess this is the last sort of bringing us back to the more recent events. I wonder if the case for that kind of hyper-formalism is stronger after the events of the past month than it was before. That we might have said before, well, look, the Constitution's structures are deeply flawed and we can do better. And so hyper-formalism, where all you do is enforce to the letter the sort of mediocre rules of the Constitution, is not a good idea. And I guess after the last month, I think we can also do a lot worse. Say what you will about our undemocratic Constitution, but at least we stick to that. And if we start introducing the permissibility of innovating around the rules of the Constitution for good causes, is that going to make it too easy for us to innovate them around for bad causes? And make the next Vice President Pence unable to stand tall on the 12th Amendment or whatever else. So I guess I worry it can get worse.
So I think I will take some of my time to respond to Will's last point, and maybe circle around to thoughts that I had for Pam. So it seems to me that there are 2 points that I think Pam's paper make. One is about some of the very basic rules, right? So when you think about the Crawford case, right, sort of like basic rules of political participation, or you think about Shelby County and you compare it to South Carolina versus Katzenbach. And then, of course, there are some different things that we can ask courts to do. So we can ask the court about Puerto Rico or DC. Right. So it seems to me that your hyper-formalism point may have some purchase when we're talking about, should the court say, okay, we're going to make Puerto Rico a state because the current frame of having a protectorate, we just can't be a colonial power. That's inconsistent with our democratic values, right? But that's so I think that would have purchase there. But it's not clear to me that it has purchase when we're talking about basic rules of political participation, right? So whether it's voting rights or vote denial sets of questions, or we're talking about areas like the Voting Rights Act, where for 50 years we assumed that Congress had the power. And interestingly, even in an area like the Chiafalo case, the faithless elector case, where you might think about hyperformalism might actually have purchase, it turns out not to. The court, there's a very consequentialist decision-making that's almost unanimous by the court. I mean, depending on how you count Thomas, right, with the court saying, yeah, but it's true, maybe on strict textualist grounds, one could have read it that way, but things have changed, right? So I think the argument for hypertextualism with respect to sort of basic rights of political participation, I don't think have much purchase, though they might have purchase if one was thinking about, are we asking the court to change sort of significant things that are really hardwired in, right? And it doesn't strike me that political gerrymandering, the same way that the reapportionment sets of cases are really hardwired in, given the things that courts have done, right? So that's my engagement with that aspect of it. But where I guess now shifting more to Pam, and I had actually had a similar set of questions that revolved around both Puerto Rico. So what is it that, what are the types of hardball moves that the political process should make? Right. So, and one example of that, so the easiest way of capturing it is to think about DC and Puerto Rico, perhaps, and then a slightly more modified version of Will's question, which is, are you expecting too much of the court and not asking enough of the political process? That is, if the argument is that countermajoritarianism is built into the constitutional structure as sometimes norms and as sometimes fundamental law and sometimes statutory law, but it's baked in, and it's baked into the structure and the way that we select judges and for the federal system, elect judges in the state system. But then we turn around to courts and to the federal courts and to say, oh, by the way, we want you to act against your nature, against the very rich. So the phrase that you use, the structural system creates countermajoritarianism, but then we want courts to act in a countermajoritarian way, especially if we're talking about things that are closer to hardwired. Are we expecting too much, given the diagnosis that you have, given the diagnosis that you've offered and the diagnosis that you've made? I will stop here.
Okay, so this is great. Let me pick up where Will left off and Guy began, which is, if the court were consistently hyper formalist, we might be in a better position, because that would allow us, and this ties in with what Guy was saying as well, to say, read the text of the 14th Amendment. Who does it say is supposed to enforce the amendment? Section 5 says Congress is supposed to enforce it, which means the Supreme Court should not be in the business of saying that when Congress says we're enforcing the 14th Amendment by having the Voting Rights Act, we're going to invent a new form of additional equal suffrage for the states, equal dignity for the states, and the like. So that I kind of agree with Will that it's not, the court shouldn't necessarily be in the business. And I've thought more about this also since Mike Seidman's paper about Rucho came out, that maybe the court didn't get it so wrong in Rucho standing alone. But if the court is going to stay out of the business of adjudicating political gerrymandering, then it needs to also stay out of the business of striking down efforts by states to have, independent redistricting commissions if the state voters think that's a good idea. Congress should be entitled to require independent redistricting commissions, not just as a matter of the manner part of the elections clause, but maybe as part of Section 5 of the 14th Amendment. If states are going to give, if Congress is going to give more protection in the National Voter Registration Act, or it's going to give more protection in HR 1 or whatever to voting rights, maybe the court should stay out of that as well. That having a court that is selectively interventionist may be the worst of all worlds. That is, either they need to be in their representation reinforcing, or they need to get out of the way while others reinforce representation. So that's one big thought that I have. Then, I love reading student notes, and there was a recent note in the Harvard Law Review that was really quite interesting. That just suggested that the way the Democrats should play hardball essentially is to essentially create 70 new states in the District of Columbia, have those states vote to amend Article 5 of the Constitution, and then amend the Senate provision and fix a whole lot of other stuff. And it was a kind of crazy thought experiment. But this question of, what kind of hardball to play, I think is a really tough question, because, and this gets back to something you were saying in our first discussion, Will, it's one thing to play hardball in a system where everybody kind of agrees on what the norms are and where the constitutional guardrails are kind of fixed. It's quite another thing to play hardball in a system where everybody already believes you're at, an existential moment. I mean, it was it was one thing, to use to actually make the metaphor concrete for Sal Magley to just kind of brush back people every now and then with pitches. It would be quite another thing when, who was the catcher who like beat Roy Campanella over the head with the baseball bat, or John Roseborough over the head with the baseball bat? Does anybody remember this? It's that famous example of like some batter just snapped and just started whacking the hell out of the catcher, and the guy was out for quite a while with serious injury, right? One of those is hardball within the game, and the other one of those is hardball out. Oh, it's Juan Marichal. Thank you, David Strauss. I knew somebody else would remember exactly what happened. But we're normally, and this goes back again to this point about what's likely to change and what isn't. Some things are reversible and some things are irreversible. And that's what worries me about, and this is not so much in the paper, but it's in the air. What worries me is, that we end up with something that's like the statement of the countries that have one person, one vote, one time. Right? As long as everybody agrees that the president has to leave at the end of his term, there's lots that works. If you get to a system in which a president believes, I don't have to leave at the end of my term, you're in a very different ballgame. And so, I think one of the most interesting things about this election is how lucky the Supreme Court must feel itself to be that it didn't actually have to take any of the election cases coming out of this election. It was just very lucky that it wasn't one state with agonizingly close vote and a state legislature that actually tried to invoke the independent state legislature doctrine. The question is, can we rely on that luck going forward? And I just honestly don't know. Will asked early at the beginning of his comment, he asked about, are there ways to get around the equal suffrage in the Senate? Obviously we could amend Article 5, because Article 5 doesn't say it can't be amended. It just says as long as it's in the Constitution, you can't amend the Senate provision. But realistically speaking, I don't see any likelihood that we would amend Article 5 to get rid of that. And I see even less likelihood that we would have any kind of legislation to take the power away from the Senate, because I don't see how, given bicameralism, you'd get that legislation through the Senate.
Although, that's what I would have said about, say, the direct election of senators. Like, what was the incentive of senators to sign on to that? And indeed, the House passed it like 20 million times, and finally the Senate.
It's kind of like you could have such a check, right? This is your point about but things could change, which is you could have such a profound change in political reality that it would somehow drive that change, right? We had a series. This is one of the great things about Alex Kesar's new book about the Electoral College. It's called something like Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College? Is the piece of the Constitution that has been subject to the most proposed amendments in our history is the Electoral College. And in 1969, it passed the House, and I believe it passed the Senate, but just not by enough of a supermajority to move to direct election of the president. The reason it didn't go through, ironically enough, was in part because African American politicians in the North thought this would decrease the voting power of African Americans because they were the key votes in northern states, and getting those northern states electoral votes was a really critical thing. So the problem is at what moment, this goes back to your point about the kind of Rawlsian veil of ignorance, right? Nobody would have adopted this system if they were behind the veil of ignorance, but nobody's behind the veil of ignorance. And so at any given point, one of the two political parties thinks the Electoral College is to its advantage and thinks the Senate is to its advantage.
So I have a question about the role of this essay in this problem. So it seems like there are some political norms here that if DC statehood may well happen, in the not too distant future. I mean, it would take filibuster reform or changing politics, but it may well happen. And it seems like DC 270 statehood, or whatever, however many the Harvard note proposed, will not happen.
Yeah, never. Yeah.
Because it's an interesting feature of partisan politics that like one hardball move will be okay, but just beating the constitutional system with the bat will not be okay.
Yeah.
So one attitude would just be to say, like the political scientists might just say, well, there you go. Like we'll have some counter moves. We won't have some other counter moves. The system will kind of keep going. I take it this might be an attempt to intervene, though, and to change what's currently seen as a permissible move or to encourage some moves and not others. So is that part of are you trying to change that conversation? And if so, to what?
So I think what I'm trying to do is get people to understand that the real problem with our system is not the countermajoritarian difficulty that everybody spends all their time talking about in con law class, but is the deeply baked in countermajoritarian, anti-democratic with a small d features of the Constitution in a country that, to go back to Guy's first point in part one, is a much more diverse, much more multi-everything country today, and is more divided among the electorate. I mean, it's not, as you've brought people into the electorate, we have a more divided electorate. We have a country that is, because of the big sort, polarized in a geographic way that wasn't necessarily true before. And the last time we found ourselves in a position, the last two times we found ourselves historically in a position like this seemed to me to be 1920, when we ended up not reapportioning at all because everybody realized what the political consequences were, and 1860, when one part of the country believed existentially that the election of a particular person as president was, the 19th century equivalent of Pizzagate and QAnon. And that's not good for politics, right? Politics needs to be lower importance and lower salience than that. Because I don't know that our system is designed to work under those situations. So it's mostly to get people to realize the Supreme Court's not going to save us from this. And there are structural features that we need to think about. DC and Puerto Rico are obviously, they're an obvious solution once you take as a given that we have the Senate we have. But it's like basically we're giving the 700,000 people in DC 2 senators because California is so big and Wyoming and now North Dakota are so small, which is kind of weird. It's a weird Burkean way of trying to fix what's the central problem, right? I mean, it's not clear why the 700,000 people in DC are the solution to are a first order solution rather than a second order solution.
Real solution might be to break up the states, right?
Yeah, well, there's always, California should become like 12 different states and then we wouldn't have this problem. Then it would just be, everything would be the House of Representatives times 2, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, since I made the claim about the court and got the fair criticism that it's not like the court is actually living up to my billing for it, I should just agree with that. Right, for the court to try to accept my defense of it, they would need to not do Shelby County. They would need to take more seriously maybe some of the like 26th Amendment and 24th Amendment claims that have been going around about, age discrimination and poll tax discrimination that the lower courts have rejected. And actually, the thing that makes me lie awake at night worrying is I have started reading an argument I used to regard as fringe, that the DC statehood is unconstitutional because it violates the original understanding that the federal district would be a federal district, not a state, not explicitly in the text.
But what counts as the federal district, right? Is it just the land that the federal government owns? Because that I kind of agree with, is you couldn't have just like the White House be a state.
Right.
Or Congress, but there are all these people living there who aren't the feds.
Right. No, the other two. So the other two steps are some claim that it violates some part of that part of the understanding of retrocession was that if the federal government wasn't using the retroceded land, they had to give it back. They couldn't do something new with it, and that it violates the amendment that gives DC electoral votes because that obviously presupposes a non-state DC. Now again, maybe the solution is to give the electoral votes only to the White House, so that
I mean, there are ways to solve all of this, obviously, and you could say, there were proposals a while back to retrocede everything in the district back to Maryland, which would then get an additional seat in Congress, and it could, so that at least the people of DC would get, a seat in Congress, and they would be able to vote for senators.
Right.
I mean, that wouldn't solve any of the other problems, but it would solve that. It would solve that problem of just being totally disenfranchised.
Right. That's what's interesting is there is a way to solve the injustice of DC residents not getting a vote that doesn't create the same distribution in the Senate. But of course, the reason to do this now is people are upset about Wyoming.
Yeah, but then I assume because of the way the retrocession works, there's also that provision in the Constitution that you can create a new state out of a state's territory with its consent. So Maryland, which is a Democratic state, could simply say, we're glad to give you this area to become its own state. Because I think all of the parts that were in Virginia have already been given back.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm lying awake and I'm worrying that somehow this is going to convince the Supreme Court to strike down DC statehood. I don't think it will, but that's what I worry about.
Yeah, I think maybe not. Maybe not. I don't know.
I'll see.
Do you want to go to questions now? I know we have 2 minutes and 20 seconds before it was on our TikTok, but I'm glad to go to questions if people want to.
Sure, I encourage people to submit their questions through the chat and through the Q&A, and we'll share those with our panelists. And let me just take this opportunity to thank our panelists for a wonderful discussion, and especially to thank Professor Carlin for a terrific lecture. And I really enjoyed the style of this. The engagement with the panelists was really terrific. So let me go to a question that's been submitted in the chat. And this is a question about whether there's an alternative to representation reinforcement, in particular deference. Could the court reject attempts to provide fair representation in the Senate, but also abandon decisions like Shelby County, Abbott versus Perez, and a perhaps forthcoming attack on the results test in the Arizona cases? And to put it differently, given the fact that the court is unlikely to favor a pro-democracy approach, is deference a better option? And if so, how could the court be pushed in that direction?
I'll take a first crack, but I'd be interested in what Will and think about this, which is, and Guy's kind of alluded to this in his comments on the second part of the paper, that there may be a real difference between the court staying out of the basic right to participate and the court staying out of everything on top of that. That maybe, when it comes to the basic right of all citizens to vote, you should read the Constitution holistically in its structure, which now suggests there really shouldn't be any bar to a citizen of voting age being able to vote, maybe leaving aside, the offender disenfranchisement piece of Richardson against Ramirez. But the rest of it, the court really should err on the side of having some pretty big representation reinforcing on the right to participate, but should stay out of the rest of it, because the rest of it, it's really hard to locate in the Constitution a theory about, winner take all versus proportionality or the like. That's really hard to get from the Constitution. But the idea that citizens should be allowed to vote and the state shouldn't restrict citizens' right to vote, I think can be derived enough from the Constitution that I would be really loath to have the Supreme Court say, okay, Crawford style draconian ID laws, perfectly okay. We'll defer on that as well. But But I see a much stronger argument for deference when it comes to, should we have districts? How should the districts be drawn or the like? Assuming, and this is the last thing I'll say about it, assuming that the court will also defer when Congress says, we think the results test should apply to districting. That deferring to the states when Congress says this is what we think should be done is not really deference. It's choosing the states over the federal government. And I'm not sure why after Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, that's a choice the court should be making.
Yeah, I mean, I largely agree with that. I mean, I think, so for me, part of the problem is a deregulatory framework that assumes that it's a wild, wild west and that everything and anything goes, and whatever the outcomes are the outcomes, right? And I think that makes it hard to have a functioning democratic politics. There has to be some set of guardrails and some set of basic rights framework. So if it's clear then that the court will protect participation rights, even basic participation rights, but then everything else, you all fight it out in democratic politics, fine. But if what we're doing is changing the basic participation rules, so that way our theories of the political process don't even work, right? So you can't say you win the election as what happened in 2020, but then the next time around, instead of convincing people to vote for you, we're going to change the rules to just make it harder for people to vote and harder for them to participate. So where then do we go from here? So there has to be some basic guardrails if it's not going to be provided in for democratic politics. But that doesn't necessarily mean that then the court is responsible for the higher order stuff. Right, and that's why I agree with Pam that you could have different types of compromises here, but at least there has to be some basic rules that are respected and protected.
So I guess I worry that I'm not sure either half of that is stable. So I think it is easy to reject Pam's holistic reading of the right to vote. I mean, not that you have to, but it's easy to say, wow, there are a lot of enumerated rights not to have race discrimination, sex discrimination, et cetera, in voting, and then sort of jumps out at you if there's not a right against these other things. So I think it's easy to for the same court to sort of defer on the first order question. And the problem is in the second order question, sometimes it can be hard to figure out who to defer to. Like in the questions about the state legislature setting electoral rules versus the state court's misinterpretations of those rules, you could cast either choice as deference. We defer to the state Supreme Court because that's the normal state process, or we defer to the state legislature. And same thing if there's a fight between, who, Congress or the state, gets to control some given question. It's harder to figure out who to defer to there. So I worry that the whole situation is going to fall apart. If Congress really wanted to push it, my advice to them would be to use the Republican form of government clause, which is supposedly non-justiciable and supposedly deals with some of these voting rights questions. So if you really wanted to have nationwide redistricting commissions and you were Congress, I think you would say, we hereby declare that it's un-Republican to let, as Pam always says, to let the leaders choose their voters rather than the other way around. We hereby require this to be a Republican form of government. Dare the Supreme Court to overturn 150 years of precedent. But
yeah, I've always thought that the guarantee clause gives a lot of purchase for a number of these things, but I don't take seriously when the court says it's non-justiciable that they mean claiming that Congress misused its power as non-justiciable, as opposed to it doesn't create justiciable rights in individuals. That is, I see a case like a version of Arizona legislature against Arizona Legislative Redistricting Commission, in which you get Arizona legislature versus United States Congress, and Congress comes in and says, well, it's totally non-justiciable because the guarantee clause gives us this. And the state comes in and says, well, what about Article 1, Section 4, which gives us this? And I find it hard to believe that the court would say, we just can't say.
Yeah, you have Shelby County all over again.
But I agree with you, Will, that this question of, well, to whom are you deferring and over what is not stable in some ways.
Can I move to the next question? This is a question about your views on the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. So this is an agreement among a group of US states to award all of their electoral votes to whichever presidential candidate wins the overall population or the overall popular vote nationwide. Would this be a good policy to adopt? Would this be a good approach to solving the larger countermajoritarian difficulty?
Will?
Any takers?
I've always been suspicious of this, and I can't tell if that's my just garden variety suspicion but so there is the standard worry about the legality of this kind of compact not having been approved by Congress and all that. And then I think the mechanics, the difficulty in the mechanics are sort of underrated. Like opponents of the the supporters of the Electoral College often say, well, look, if we had a nationwide popular vote, imagine all the trouble we'd have with recounts and trying to fight about who won and the election is close. And, wasn't that close this time, but it will be sometime. I think the one time I tried to dig into the technicalities of how the compact worked, it looks like they're even worse under a compact because you lose the ability to avail yourself of some of the state machinery of recounts and other methods of determining the popular vote. If the only reason the popular vote matters is because of this second order compact that then each state would have to interpret for themselves and each state would have to decide who they thought was the popular vote winner, and then we have to litigate who is in control of that. So I do worry it's creating a second level of electoral chaos on top of our current one. But hey, if the Electoral College is bad enough,
Yeah, I had thought that the first question is really one of whether Congress would approve the compact, because if Congress approves the compact, then the constitutional issue disappears. And so there's just this question, would Congress be interested in it? And then, as Will says, the devil is a lot in the details, because it does mean that you could end up with a lot more litigation over the election, because right now, for example, there's no point in litigating by how much did Joe Biden beat Donald Trump in California. It just doesn't matter. But one thing is, even with the big sort, there are more Republican voters in California than there are in 15 states that are always red. It's just that they're outvoted by the Democratic voters in California. And so you would end up with a lot of litigation over precise vote totals in a lot of places where you're now kind of spared that litigation. And different states have different rules on who gets to vote. And so the question of, is it fair to use a system if in California everybody gets to vote, but in Indiana the voter ID law restricts voting a lot? I just think we would be better off, if we're going to go to a popular election of the president, going to a popular election of the president.
And this is, what Mark Tushnet calls the workaround, right? And part of the question here is the extent to which we are trying to mirror a popular vote without dealing with the fundamental constitutional questions. And it goes to sort of the second part of your paper, Pam, right? Sort of both the structural and hardwired difficulties, as well as the cultural and normative difficulties that are within the Constitution, and whether we can do anything about it. Now, I do think that culturally, we think that we have a national election. I think that is where we are culturally, and arguably that was the court's assumption in, say, the Chiafalo case. But the question is, the reality of it, obviously, is the state-by-state differing state rules. And part of the question is, eventually, how do we reconcile those two things, right? Our cultural expectations with the reality. And the part of your paper that talks about the inversion is the place, too, where those things come together.
Yeah, if I could just add one thing here, which goes to Will's point about change versus, what's changeable and what's not. Which is, if we had a national popular election for president, the candidates would have completely different strategies for running. The parties would sponsor very different candidates, because then they would have to ask, what candidate will appeal to the median national voter, right? That's the voter who becomes critical. And that voter may have very little in common with the median voter in Ohio. Those two people may be very different one from another. And so people's assumption about what would happen if we had a national popular vote for the presidency raises the question of, well, who would be running and what would their platform be? The Republican Party would have to move to the left. The Democratic Party might have to move to the right. So you might see very different candidates running. That is, you can't hold the candidates and the parties constant and change completely the system in which they're operating.
So these thoughts only could have been belatedly, but so one other problem with this, now that I think about it, is Maine. So Maine now has ranked choice voting. And as my friend Steve Saxon once put it out to me, it's not even clear where they count in the popular vote. Like who won the popular vote in Maine depends on how you run through the ranked choice voting, which is another, God forbid us if elections within the boundaries of Maine. But maybe the point of the National Popular Vote Compact is not to be law, but is to be a way station. Maybe the idea is, if we adopt the National Popular Vote Compact, it'll quickly prove unworkable, and yet it'll demonstrate popular support for a popular vote. And then we can finally amend the Electoral College. So it doesn't matter that it doesn't work. We're like missing the point of being annoying lawyers. The point is to just sort of push us over the precipice so we can finally fix this.
Yeah, but then it's like everything else, which is, if it's a way station, that's fine. If it like completely, this is why I often thought, Akhil Amar had this, his student note proposed lottery voting, right? Which was, the idea was you create proportionality because you just pluck one of the votes out of the pile and that person would be the winner. And it doesn't work that terribly if you're electing a 100-member legislative body, but it works really badly if you're electing just one person, because 1% of the time, you're going to pick somebody that only has 1% of the popular support. And that person could be a total dictator and you never get another election. And so a lot of it is this question of how stable is the system overall so that it could take one of these perturbations and then move past the kind of place in which it's not working at all. And I just don't know these days. I just don't know these days. I just don't know.
Well, I think we are almost out of time, and I apologize because we do have several other questions in the chat. I apologize that we didn't have time to get to them, but I really want to thank Professor Carlin for an incredibly informative and thought-provoking Jorde lecture. I want to thank Professor Charles and Professor Baude for insightful comments and just a wonderful dialogue today over these topics. And most of all, I want to thank, of course, the Brennan Center and allowing us to co-sponsor this event and to be the host in virtual format. I hope that we will host again in the future, and I hope that when that happens, we'll do it again in person. And I most of all, of course, want to thank all of our participants and attendees today. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your participation. And very much, once more, thank our honoree, Professor Pamela Carlin. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you for having us.